I'm a little torn right now because I'm actually very much a warm weather person. I'd rather take 100 degrees than even like 40. I want to sweat. I don't like the cold. However, I've been really challenged the last like 10 days. It's the middle of December and it's 65 like every day, and so I do find part of myself wanting a little colder weather. We right now this morning it was actually quite a bit colder, but I have decided in my own heart which one I currently want, but I want to gauge with you, the rest of the church, where your opinion is on this. So if you are one of the people that say, just keep it 65 all winter long, I'm fine with that. Can you raise your hand? Keep the warm weather. And if you are the other direction saying, it's winter for crying out loud, bring on the cold. Okay, about half and half. I have decided that I'm betraying myself a little bit, but I'm ready for a little bit of cold, just a little bit, maybe about 48 hours, and then I'll be good going back to 65. Hey, a week, let's see, we're about a week away from our Christmas Eve service, and for kids, this is your last week of school, and so at the exits, we actually have Christmas Eve invitation cards, and so this has become one of the more popular events of the year for our church family, and so if you have someone that you'd want to invite to that, you're welcome to pick up one of these invitation cards and just pass it out to a coworker or a classmate or a neighbor. It's actually a very easy, non-anxious way to share a little bit of part of your church family and your faith with somebody that you know, and it's become one of our treasured traditions at this church family. I don't know if you were there for the one last year, but we did it in the parking lot, and it was freezing cold. It was very, very cold that night. But we're looking forward to that on Christmas Eve. So earlier this year, our country lost a pretty significant political figure. His name was Colin Powell, and I got to hear him speak at a conference one time, a remarkable speaker, and he had quite a career in politics. He started out in the military, and he was a Vietnam War vet, and then he actually worked for quite a few presidents. So he worked for Reagan, and then for Bush, and then for Clinton, and then for Bush again, in various roles. The highest role he achieved was Secretary of State. And he could have gone even further. In fact, he did something that, if this happened today, would be absolutely, unequivocally stunning in our political environment. In the late 90s, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party tried to get him to run for the president as their candidate. They both wanted him. Can you imagine that happening today? There's no way that would happen today. Well, it says a lot about Colin, though. He, more than just someone who held various political views, he was really known for just being a good leader. He was a great leader. In fact, I read a story back when he was Secretary of State. This is 2001. There was a U.S. motorcade in Israel that was taking a U.S. diplomat somewhere, and they caught fire from some local Israeli soldiers. And the lead security guard got on the phone to his boss and said, hey, we're taking fire. We need some backup. We need some cover. We don't know what to do. And his boss then called the U.S. Embassy in Israel and said, hey, we've got soldiers taking fire. We need them to stop. Well, the U.S. Embassy guy called back to stateside to Colin Powell and said, can you do something? Well, Colin Powell just picks up the phone and calls the Prime Minister of Israel. He says, hey, would you get your guys to back off? And the Prime Minister of Israel says, sure. He gets them to back off. That's the kind of leader that Colin Powell was. He had so much respect across party lines in the U.S., but also just worldwide. He's just a good leader. When I heard him speak at a conference one time, he talked about his leadership principles. He became very famous for this. He has 13 of them. I'll mention 5 of them to you. So these are just leadership principles that he cultivated over the course of his life. So number 1 would be this: it's not as bad as you think. It'll be better in the morning. It's usually true. Number 2, get mad, then get over it. Great advice. Number 3, this is really important. Don't become so attached to an argument that if it fails, your ego goes with it. It's a great sentiment there. And I just love the first clause. Just don't get overly attached to an argument. Number 4, don't let adverse facts stand in the way of a good decision. What a great piece of advice. Many of us struggle with this one. We want to make a decision, and we feel like it's the right decision, but then there's one person that has a dissenting view or a dissenting opinion, and then it puts us into paralysis, and we don't know what to do. A good decision can still be a good decision, even if not everybody agrees with it. And number 5, he says, you can't make someone else's decision, which again is just a really, really good leadership principle. Now, it's easy when you talk about leadership to think about Colin Powell and think that leadership is all about the powerful and the mighty and the wealthy and people in politics and people in suits who don't smile, and leadership is for people that have corner offices and tall buildings, and you know that's just not true. Leadership is so much more than that. In fact, I love how author Miles Monroe puts it. He says leadership is the capacity to influence others. It's a really broad definition, and the reason I like it is because if what he's saying is true, then leadership happens all the time. Leadership happens in the lunchroom and the living room. Leadership happens when two friends go out for coffee. Leadership happens when families make holiday plans. Leadership happens when you make a sale at work or when you lose a client at work. Leadership happens in the first hour of your workday. Leadership happens in the last 30 minutes of your workday. Leadership happens when a husband and a wife sit down and have a very important conversation. Leadership happens when friends are deciding where to go hang out after church. It happens all the time because anywhere that there is influence, there is leadership. And so even for you 8, 9, 10-year-old kids still tracking with me on this message, and you think, well, you don't have leadership, that's all the old people in your life. No, you do. There's some 5-year-old out there that thinks you're a superhero. Everybody has influence over somebody, and therefore everybody has something to learn about leadership. And here's the sad thing is that for many of us, we don't work on our leadership. A lot of us assume that leadership is a gift. And some people like Colin Powell have it, and many people don't have it, and we just kind of move on with life, and we assume that it's not something you really work on. Leadership is more craft than gift. Like, you can actually get better at being a leader. And for the sake of the people that you actually influence, like for those people in your life that do think you're special, and again, everybody has somebody that thinks they're special, so everybody is a leader to somebody. For the sake of those people, like, you owe it to them to work on your leadership. So imagine for a moment that you really spent a week, a month, 6 months, a year working on how you lead, how you carry yourself. You would actually make quite an impact on the people that you influence. And so for a moment, I just want to sit on this particular topic. How might you go about stewarding your leadership? And so to do that, I want to reflect on a text. And if you went to an adult Bible class, you also reflected on this text. I'll probably come at it from a slightly different angle. But I want to go to 1 Timothy chapter 3. And so the background here is Paul, he starts out against Jesus, attacking Christians. Then he goes through this Damascus amazing experience where he hears from Christ in heaven. He has this radical conversion. Then he goes around and he starts planting churches in the name of Jesus. And he writes all these letters from the New Testament. Well, Paul knows that he's not going to live forever, that he's going to die and await resurrection one day, which he wrote so much about and preached so much about. And so before he passes away, he's trying to add stability to these churches that he has started. And the primary way that he's adding stability is he's trying to establish elderships. Because he knows, and you know this, we all know this intuitively, that churches don't function very well if every single week people are just showing up and looking at each other and saying, well, what are we going to do today? That doesn't work. You need vision. You need management. You need a strategy. And so Paul is trying to establish the kinds of people who can lead the church forward. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 is a section where he says, okay, here's the kind of person I am thinking about. So as we get into this text, I encourage you to think about it on two different levels. Level number one is, how can I be a better leader? Level number two, and this is in context of our church family in this moment right now, who could I recommend to be an elder? So I want you to think about, okay, who's someone I know that might be a good elder for this church, because this is very, very important for the future of our church family. We've had a lot of elders since since our church was founded 58 years ago. In fact, so just a few days ago, I was thinking, how many elders have we had? And so I asked around to a few people and found some resources, and I found the number of elders that we've had in our church family. And then I decided that I was going to ask our current elders that trivia question. How many of our current elders know, or what would be their best guess as to how many elders we have had over our history? So I sent them an email and said, hey, give me your best guess. And on Sunday, I will announce to the whole church the wisest elder, like the one that really knew. So before I tell you the answer to that question, make a wild guess. Again, we've been around 58 years. Just make up a number and tell it to your neighbor just to see if you were right. Total number of elders. Okay, the correct answer is we have had a total of 58 elders. 58. Okay, raise your hand if you shot high, if you were higher than that. Raise your hand if you were lower than that. Okay, most people shot high. Just so you know, the elders that sent in answers, which was most of them, the range was very significant. I mean, we're talking in the hundreds on the range from the low end to the high end. 58 is the answer. Now, to the bigger question is, okay, well, which elder got it closest? There's two answers to this. Number one of our elders who's involved in the process each time we do this, Dan Waugh, he actually has a document where he is keeping track of this. And so he emailed me and said, well, Phil, I already knew the answer. The answer's 58. So Dan Waugh gets the award for being the most honest elder. Yay, Dan. Okay. Now, of the elders that actually just made a guess, just totally out of the blue guess, the elder that got the closest was the most handsome elder and the wisest elder, Steve Brookman. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? My father, very wise man. I was so excited when I read through that list. So anyway, we've had 58 elders, and it's very significant in the history of our church family. These processes make a big difference. And so I do want you to think about, okay, who is someone that I might know that might be a good elder? So I want to read this text, and then I'll make a few comments about it. 1 Timothy chapter 3, starting in verse 2. Now the overseer, and there's several words in the Bible for elders, overseer, bishop, shepherd, elder. They all functionally mean the same thing in the New Testament. Now the overseer must be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. Two general observations, first of all. Number one, oftentimes we read this passage and think, okay, that is the passage for the elders, not for me. Let's pause and interrogate the validity of that thought. If a violin player who was just beginning saw a video of a virtuoso violin player, would that beginning violin player say, well, this does not apply to me? Or if an average chess player watched the game of a grandmaster, would that average chess player say, oh, well, this is not important? Well, of course not. The beginning violin player knows, and the average chess player knows, that they are looking upon and gazing upon people who have become very proficient in the discipline that they are undertaking. And so when we read this paragraph, what we're really reading about is these are people who have been walking with Jesus for a really, really long time. And they've been transformed by the Spirit for a long time. And Paul is saying these are the people who are very proficient at walking with Christ. And so this paragraph, it is not just for people that want to be elders. This paragraph is for people who want to be better disciples. So this paragraph is actually for all of us. Now, the second thing I want to point out about this paragraph, just generally speaking, is that did you notice that Paul does not talk about responsibilities? He doesn't say a word about it. Now, if you were in our adult Bible classes, again, we've just reflected on this text for a while, so maybe you picked up on this, but Paul doesn't say a word about what they should do. He doesn't say you should go run the benevolence program, or you should recruit the volunteers, or you should pick out the songs. Like, he doesn't say any of that. The only thing he says is, here's the kinds of qualities that should embody an overseer. Now, why would he do that? Like, why wouldn't he list specific specific responsibilities? Well, one scholar, I like how he phrased it. He said this: faithful doing comes from faithful being. And I really like that concept. So, are there tasks to be done for leaders, for shepherds? Well, sure. Teaching, planning, protecting, shepherding, just taking care of the flock. There are so many things that need to be done. But if you get the right kind of person who has the right kind of being, then the doing will come from the being. And this really is not just an elder principle. This is just a disciple principle. Like, you can either work on your walk with Christ. You can do this with grit and effort, like trying to do all the right things and making a big list of all your responsibilities, or you can really cultivate a sense of being. Like this is the Mary Martha continuum here. Like, the person who sits at the feet of Jesus consistently often is the person who does the right thing. And so doing really comes from being here. And so, having said that, if we had to boil it all down, like, what are the kind of people that do make good leaders, good shepherds, or in general, like, what are the kind of people that Paul would say when you've been walking with Christ a really long time and you've been transformed by the Spirit for a really long time? What does that really look like? I want to give you 3 qualities that I think emerge from the list of 15. So here's a set that I want to start with. Verse 2, Paul says that this person is faithful to his wife. And in verse 3, he says he's not given to drunkenness. And then he also says he's not a lover of money. Okay, so what can you glean if you take all those phrases together? What I glean from that is that a good leader is going to be a person that has integrity, like deep personal integrity. In fact, if you really think about some of these phrases, like the husband of one wife, so in the ancient Greco-Roman world, monogamy was a minority. Like, this was not the bona fide accepted cultural position of the day. In fact, in the Greco-Roman world, it was more common, especially for men, to have multiple wives and to really, their life would be a sexual pursuit. You make sure to have multiple partners. This is just the way that the world works in ancient Rome. And so for Paul to say this is actually astounding. What Paul is saying is, okay, if you want to be a leader, a Christian leader, and a Christian leader in the church of God, you go back to Genesis 2, where God sets out his plan for marriage. And in Genesis 2, marriage is both covenantal and it's complementary. And so Paul is saying you go back to that particular view. Now, that view today is seen as archaic, is seen as completely out of date, out of touch with reality. And in some circles, that view is seen as downright repressive. Now, here's the case I'm trying to make. It was seen as out of date 2,000 years ago when Paul wrote this. So Paul was living in a culture which was not about monogamy. And he was saying, no, but leaders in God's church they've got to have this integrity. And so in other words, when Christians live by this principle, we do shine in a world that does not share this particular virtue. In fact, I found this really interesting. I was reading the other day, and so there's a 2nd century scholar. He was actually a doctor. His name is Galen, and he was not a Christian, and pretty much everything he wrote about was in the medical world. But every once in a while, he would just make a comment about this, what he would call this really strange sect of people that called themselves Christians. And the only things he knew about Christians, I just find this so interesting. He basically knew two things. He said, I don't know anything about these Christians except two things. Number one, they believe in the resurrection of the dead, which he thought was just preposterous. And he said, number two, they don't sleep around. That was the reputation of the earliest followers of Jesus. We believe in resurrection, and we're people of deep, devout, personal integrity. We don't sleep around. Like, can you imagine if Christians today had that kind of a reputation? It would be remarkable. So again, the point is, leaders take very seriously personal integrity. And it's not just in the realm of sexuality. I mean, Paul says they're not given to drunkenness. So a good leader is not someone that goes to the bar and has one drink after another drink after another drink and then says, oh, I think I can have just one more. Oh, I think I'm just fine. No, many people do that, but if you're going to be a leader, you're going to be really careful about that. He also says that they're not a lover of money. Well, that's really interesting because oftentimes, again, in our culture, this is amazing. Our culture like subconsciously worships wealth. And so maybe you've noticed this, but when someone becomes really, really wealthy in really any arena of life, then they are asked questions that have nothing to do with their discipline, and they're listened to simply because they have wealth. And what Paul is saying is that leaders, like mature followers of Jesus, they might be wealthy, but they won't be lovers of money. And so what this means is it could very well be that the most Christian, mature person that you know does not have that much money. And that does not make them a bad leader. In fact, good Christian leaders, they're not going to be the ones that talk about the house that they don't have. And they're not going to be the ones that are always comparing themselves to the success of other people. They're actually going to be very, very content with what they have. They won't be spun up by the various shades of greed that we find in the world. They will be so satisfied with what God has given them. Christian leaders are going to be people that take their personal integrity very, very seriously. And this is why in another verse here in this paragraph, Paul says they're above reproach. Like people are not going to say, well, yeah, Jim's a good guy, but he just doesn't treat his employees very well. He's a great guy, but he has a horrible pornography addiction. He's a great guy, but he does not treat his spouse very well. Like you're not going to hear that about a Christian leader. Now at this point, after this first section of the sermon, some of you might think, okay, Phil, I get that, but it does seem like you're leaning into the coulda, woulda, shoulda kind of a sermon, and you're just saying you should just go out and never make mistakes, and you should always be perfect, and that's the only kind of leaders we should pick are just those that are just walk on this pedestal, but how in the world can anybody do that? Like you're setting this standard, Phil, like no one can do what you're doing. And what about grace? And what about forgiveness? And if you are thinking that, I would say this, nobody's perfect. And at the heart of the gospel is grace, and it is forgiveness. And we don't earn our salvation by what we do, but because of what God did. So I fully acknowledge that. But I would also say that sanctification is so central to the gospel as well. Sanctification is the process by which we are formed over time to be closer and closer to the image of Jesus. And it's a real thing. Like I've been rereading Philippians chapter 1 in particular of late, and I've been so struck by the idea that God is the one that works in us over time to the day that Jesus comes back. Like that's what Philippians 1:6 says, is that God will start a work in you, and he will be the one to keep working on you until the day of salvation when Jesus comes back. And that's such a comforting thought to me that I'm an unfinished product. I still have flaws. I'm somewhere on this conveyor belt, and God is still working on me. Like, it really does happen. Sanctification is a real thing. So I made a point earlier this year about fear. I said that we can't be fearless, like totally, but it is possible to fear less. Like you can have a little less fear in your life tomorrow than you had today. That same idea can be applied to sin. So you can't be sinless because you're not Jesus, but you can sin less. The longer you walk with Christ, the more you read Scripture, the more you come to church and sing these songs and just become part of the body of Christ. And when you do that over time and really open your heart up, like, okay, Lord, what are you wanting from me? Like, okay, Lord, reveal to me where I need to grow. If you really do that over time, you actually start to become more like Jesus. And so I'm not saying that we all have to be perfect, but I am saying if you want to lead, like if you want to have influence, then you pay a lot of attention to your personal integrity. Now, that's not the only thing. There are two more. So here's another just collection of phrases from this really interesting passage. The overseer must be respectable and hospitable. So hospitable, the actual word means friend of strangers. And so what Paul is getting at here is that the leader is not only concerned about just the people that he knows or she knows, but a leader is actually concerned about what's going on outside the people that they know. Then Paul goes on to say this: he must also have a good reputation with outsiders. Okay, so yes, a leader should have personal integrity, but the personal integrity should never drive a wedge between the leader and the outside world. In other words, the leader should have such a relationship with the outside world that the outside world actually has a lot of respect for the leader. And so here's the second principle. First is personal integrity. The second principle is cultural engagement. It's like the leader should actually have relationships with people that don't know Jesus. Whether that's a classmate at school or a neighbor down the street or a coworker or maybe even a family member. Like the leader should not just be stuck in their own echo chamber. They really should have relationships with people outsiders. In fact, this is one of the things that's been so encouraging to me, that like our shepherds are leading the way with this refugee program we have going on over the last few months. Like they are the ones driving it. They're setting up these apartments and meeting with these families and going shopping with these families, and it's like the long term, like having them into their homes, like they want to bless the outsider. And I'm so moved by that, and I'm so inspired by that, because that's what leaders should do. They should be leading the way on those efforts. And the reason this is so important is because people, they might reject your beliefs, but if you carry yourself with this kind of a love for the outsider, then what happens is, yes, they might reject your beliefs, but they're going to respect your compassion. They're going to be like, yeah, I don't agree with what he thinks about that, but you know what? Wow, I love how he treated this person. That's why we do this. So good leaders are not merely concerned with placating the opinions of the insiders. They are equally concerned with seeing the needs of the outsiders. And so good leaders, again, they're not just concerned with, we just got to manage the opinions of the people who are already here. The good leaders are thinking about, okay, who's not here? Like, who's going to be the voice of the person that's not even in the pew? That's on the heart of a good leader. So number one is personal integrity. Number two is cultural engagement. Let me go back to the text one more time. Here's another collection of words. The overseer is temperate, so not extreme, self-controlled, gentle, not violent, not quarrelsome. All right, so how do we put all that together, those particular phrases? Well, a few comments I would make is, one, the leader does not walk around with a chip on their shoulder looking to pick a fight. And the leader does not always feel that they have to win at all costs. And the leader doesn't make other people feel smaller. And the leader diffuses conflict. So here's how I would wrap all that up into one word. A leader carries a non-anxious presence. So there's two kinds of people in the world. There are people that raise the anxiety of the room and people that lower the anxiety of the room. And you intuitively know which kind of person you're around because they're going to increase your anxiety or decrease your anxiety. Like, you know what it's like to be around either one of those kinds of people. Well, leaders are definitely the ones that lower the anxiety of the room. There's been a lot written about this in like modern day just leadership literature. So one newer work that's been out that the author writes a lot about this is the author's name is Stephen Cuss. The book is called Managing Leadership and Anxiety. And he's a great author. He has a great podcast on the subject. So again, his name is Stephen Cuss. If you want to look up his website, it's a great website. It's stephencusswords.com, if you just want to remember that. Well, his big thing that he talks about is that he defines leadership as the ability to manage your own anxiety within complex, anxious systems. And he's got a really good point here. And so one of the things that he talks about is that anxiety is contagious. Like, it's like a virus. So a virus does not exist without a host. Like there is no computer virus without a computer. There would be no coronavirus without people to spread that around. Well, the same is true with anxiety. Anxiety does not exist without people. Like, you're never going to hear a news story where some archaeologist digging in some other part of the world digs down and they find all these things and they say, oh, I found anxiety. It's not going to be there because anxiety only exists in us. And so some of us are universal anxiety spreaders. Everybody's anxious. You just got to give it all out. We spread it everywhere. We spread it to our friends and our neighbors and our coworkers. And let me tell you, around Christmas time, we all start spreading anxiety to our family members who we love and hate the most. It's odd how that works. Like, this is going to be happening a lot over the next few weeks. And so leaders are people who have the ability to not let the anxiety of the system infect their own heart. It's very hard to do, but again, it's a skill. You can learn how to be a non-anxious presence. So here's something that'll probably happen over the next few weeks, just a hypothetical scenario. So let's say that there's some adult siblings, and let's say a sister calls her brother and says, you're not going to believe what Jamie did. Let's say Jamie's another sister. Jamie is not going to buy Christmas gifts for her nephews. Those are my kids. Can you believe that? And maybe the brother says, well, no, I can't believe that. Although, come to think about it, when I was 10, she broke my PlayStation. So she's just the kind of girl that would do. I can't believe this is real. I'm calling Mom. Mom, Jamie's not going to buy Christmas gifts for her nephews. That's ridiculous. Can you believe that, Mom? Well, ever since the day she came out of the womb, I thought she was different, And, and remember last year, when I was trying to get the family together to do Christmas pictures, and she just refused to wear the correct color. I mean, it's ridiculous. I think I'm going to uninvite her to the meal, or at least I'm not going to bake her favorite pie. This is just da-da-da-da. And you know how this goes. It's just like ping, 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 ping. We all just receive the anxiety, and then we spread it without thinking about it, and then we wonder why our family gatherings are so tense. What would a leader do here? Like, what would a leader do the way that Paul's describing it? Well, a leader would not allow the pathology of the system to become their own. A leader practices self-differentiation here, and so maybe a leader on the phone call hears what so-and-so is saying about Jamie, and maybe the leader says, okay, sounds like Jamie has some issues. What do you want for Christmas? That's what leaders do. Not in a sense that they're denying the problem, but they're not going to let the dysfunction affect them. That's what non-anxious people do. And you can always tell when you've been around a non-anxious person because you feel just a little bit better. And you can always tell when you've been around an anxious person because you feel, when you walk away, just a little bit more anxious. In fact, I experienced this last week. I actually experienced this quite a bit. I love spending time with our shepherds, but I got to I had several times last week where I spent time with shepherds, but a few of the occasions last week, shepherds actually reached out to me and said, hey, Phil, can we just spend time together? And we did. And we talked about life. I felt very heard, listened to, and I walked away from these conversations feeling just a little bit better about life. Why? simply because I was in the presence of a non-anxious person. So imagine, again, what could your next year look like if you spent just a little bit of time working on your leadership? Like if you worked on being a person of integrity and a person that engaged with the culture and really worked on being a non-anxious presence. Wow. Like, can you fathom the kind of an impact you would make on the people that are even closest to you? Can you fathom the kind of person you would be? Like, you'd be a less anxious person if you worked on your leadership this year. And the reason we should all at least try this, even for a day, for a week, just try it over Christmas, is because if you think about it, here's a great truth. The most non-anxious being in the universe is God himself. God is the ultimate non-anxious being. I love the verse in 1 Peter where Peter says, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Well, the reason you can cast all of your anxiety on God is because God can handle it. Only a non-anxious being could handle the anxiety of the world. And so part of the reason we worship and part of the reason we pray, part of the reason we sing, is in doing these acts of worship, we really are casting the things that bother us onto the heart of God. And so we're about to sing a song, and as we do, I encourage you, make this particular song a moment where you take like one thing that's bothering you, like right now. Everybody's stressed out about something. It's part of the reason we worship. Worship changes how we feel about our problems. And so as we sing this particular song, just offer it. Offer it to the God who loves you more than you could possibly know. If you need to respond publicly, you're welcome to come share what's going on in your life with me, and we're happy to respond. And also remember, a week from today, we'd love to have recommendations from you of men that you think could serve as shepherds in this congregation. Let's stand.